I was a soldier in Operation Highjump. What we saw beyond the ice wall changed everything. Before I begin, I need you to understand how you're hearing this. The recording you're about to listen to was made by Captain Robert James Callahan in November 2024, when he was 105 years old, just 3 weeks before his death in a care facility in San Diego, California. I'm not Robert Callahan. I'm the person he trusted to release this testimony after his passing, someone who spent 2 years verifying his credentials, cross-referencing his story with declassified documents, and confirming that he was exactly who he claimed to be, the last living survivor of Operation Highjump, the 1946-47 Antarctic expedition that officially never found anything unusual, but unofficially changed everything the U.S. government understood about the planet we live on. Captain Callahan recorded over 40 hours of testimony, which I've compiled into this series. What you're about to hear are his words, his voice, his truth, and I'm bringing them to you now because the world needs to know what happened beyond the ice wall, before the government controls the narrative of what's about to emerge from Antarctica. My name is Robert James Callahan, Captain United States Navy, retired. I am 105 years old as I record this on November 15, 2024, and I am the last living witness to what really happened during Operation Highjump in 1946 and 1947. 17 other men who were with me on that mission have died over the past 77 years, some from old age, but many from accidents, sudden illnesses, and suicides that weren't suicides. I outlived them all not because I'm stronger or luckier, but because I learned early to keep my mouth shut, to play by their rules, and to wait. I waited 77 years for this moment, for the day when I'd be too old and too close to death for them to silence me effectively, when releasing this information would cost them more than it would save them. That day is now. I'm dying. My heart is failing. My doctors give me weeks at most, and I will not take this secret to my grave. What I'm about to tell you will sound insane. You'll think I'm a senile old man suffering from dementia, or that this is an elaborate hoax designed to exploit conspiracy theories about Antarctica and Hollow Earth. I don't care what you think initially, because I'm going to give you enough verifiable information. Dates, coordinates, names of people and ships, details that can be cross-referenced with declassified documents, that you'll realize this isn't fantasy or delusion. This is testimony from a naval officer who flew reconnaissance missions over Antarctica in 1947, who descended through an opening in the ice that shouldn't exist, who made contact with a civilization that has been living beneath the surface of our planet for over 15,000 years, and who spent the rest of his life watching the government cover up the most significant discovery in human history. I was 28 years old in December 1946 when I reported to the Naval Air Station in Norfolk, Virginia, for assignment to what was being called the largest Antarctic expedition ever mounted. Operation Highjump, they called it. 4,700 men, 13 ships, 33 aircraft, including 6 helicopters, and enough equipment and supplies to establish permanent bases on the most hostile continent on Earth. The official story was that we were going to test equipment in extreme cold, establish research stations, and train personnel for polar operations. That was the story they told the press, the story they told Congress, the story they told most of the men who volunteered for the mission. But those of us who were pilots, those of us who had top-level security clearances from our service in World War II, we got a different briefing behind closed doors. The real briefing came from Admiral Richard Byrd himself, a man I'd admired since childhood, a legendary polar explorer who'd flown over the North Pole in 1926 and led multiple expeditions to Antarctica in the 1930s. He gathered about 30 of us, pilots and senior officers only, in a secured room and told us what we were really looking for: Nazi bases. Intelligence suggested that in the final months of the war, as the Third Reich collapsed, high-ranking SS officers and scientists had escaped to Antarctica with advanced technology, possibly jet aircraft, possibly submarines, possibly weapons more dangerous than anything the Allies had developed. There were rumors of a base called New Swabia, in the region Germany had claimed during a 1938-39 expedition. Rumors of underground facilities carved into the ice. Rumors that Hitler's most trusted people had fled there rather than face capture. Our mission was to find these installations and neutralize them before the Soviets discovered them and gained access to whatever technology the Nazis had been developing. But Admiral Byrd told us something else. something that made less sense at the time but would prove to be the real reason for the mission. He told us about reports from earlier expeditions, his own and others, of anomalous readings from the interior of Antarctica, warm air currents rising from areas that should be frozen solid, magnetic disturbances that made compasses spin uselessly, and most disturbing, reports from Norwegian whalers in the 1930s of seeing what they described as land beyond the ice, green valleys, ice-free water, and terrain that shouldn't exist according to any map we had of the continent. Admiral Byrd himself had mentioned in interviews after his 1929 expedition that there were lands beyond the pole that remained unexplored, comments that had been downplayed and dismissed by the scientific community, but that had apparently caught the attention of military intelligence. "Gentlemen," Admiral Byrd said to us that day in Norfolk, his face grave in a way I'd never seen before, "we're going to Antarctica to hunt Nazis, but we're also going to investigate phenomena that may challenge everything we understand about the geography of our planet. You've been selected because you're the best pilots we have, because you can handle extreme conditions, and because your psychological profiles indicate you can maintain operational security, even when confronted with information that contradicts established knowledge. What we find down there stays down there, unless we're explicitly authorized to discuss it. You will sign non-disclosure agreements that carry criminal penalties, including execution for treason. You will understand that this mission may require you to keep secrets for the rest of your lives, and you will accept that if you speak about what you see without authorization, consequences will be severe for you and your families." I signed the papers without hesitation, the way young men do when they think they're invincible and believe that patriotic duty outweighs personal risk. I had no wife yet, no children, just a mother back in Ohio who was proud that her son was serving his country. I thought I was signing up to hunt Nazi stragglers in the frozen wasteland at the bottom of the world. I thought the worst thing I might encounter would be hostile German soldiers with stolen technology. I had no idea that within 2 months I would fly through an opening in the ice into another world, that I would make contact with beings who remembered the last ice age, or that I would spend the next 77 years watching every major government on Earth collaborate to hide the truth about what lies beneath Antarctica and what that truth means for human history, geography, and our understanding of the planet itself. We departed Norfolk on December 2nd, 1946, in a convoy of ships that stretched across the horizon: the flagship USS Mount Olympus, the aircraft carrier USS Philippine Sea, destroyers, submarines, support vessels, and icebreakers, designed to carve through polar seas. I was assigned to the Philippine Sea as part of the Air Reconnaissance Squadron, flying R-4D aircraft, military versions of the DC-3 that had been modified for cold weather operations. The journey south took weeks, crossing the Atlantic, stopping briefly in Panama, then heading down the coast of South America, before turning east toward the Antarctic Peninsula. During that voyage, we trained constantly: cold weather survival, emergency procedures for landing on ice, radio protocols for operating in regions where atmospheric conditions could disrupt normal communications, and we speculated, the way soldiers always do, about what we were really going to find down there. By late December, we reached the edge of the pack ice, and even from the deck of the Philippine Sea, I could see why Antarctica had defeated so many earlier expeditions. The ice stretched in all directions, massive sheets of it grinding against each other with sounds like thunder, icebergs the size of buildings drifting past the ship, and beyond it all, the white expanse of the continent itself, a hostile wilderness that had killed men far more experienced than us. The temperature was already below 0 Fahrenheit, and would only get colder as we penetrated deeper south. But we had advantages that earlier explorers hadn't: modern icebreakers, aircraft for reconnaissance, radio communication, and the resources of the entire United States Navy behind us. We thought we were prepared for anything Antarctica could throw at us. We were wrong, because what we found wasn't a force of nature, or a hidden Nazi base, or any threat we'd trained to handle. What we found was proof that everything humanity believed about our planet's geography and history was incomplete at best, and at worst, a carefully maintained lie that was about to be shattered forever. We established our primary base on January 15, 1947, at a location the Navy designated as Little America 4, built on the Ross Ice Shelf on the edge of what maps called the Bay of Whales. It wasn't really a bay, it was a massive indentation in the ice shelf, a temporary feature that could disappear if the ice calved away, but it provided the closest thing to a natural harbor we were going to find in that godforsaken landscape. The temperature that day was minus 37 degrees Fahrenheit, and that was considered relatively warm for the Antarctic summer. We worked 18-hour days unloading equipment from the ships before the sea ice closed in and trapped them for the winter, constructing prefabricated buildings that had been designed to withstand winds of up to 150 miles per hour and preparing the aircraft for reconnaissance flights that would map the interior of the continent. I remember standing on the ice that first week, looking out at the endless white expanse stretching to the horizon in every direction, and feeling utterly insignificant. Antarctica is larger than the United States and Mexico combined, over 5 million square miles of ice that in some places is 3 miles thick. Most of it had never been seen by human eyes, never been mapped, never been explored beyond a few coastal regions. We were like ants trying to survey an ocean, equipped with the best technology 1947 could offer, but still pathetically unprepared for the scale of what we were attempting. And yet, there was something exhilarating about it too. The same feeling that must have driven every explorer who'd ever pushed into unknown territory. The sense that beyond the next ridge or over the next mountain range, you might find something that changed everything. The official mission began immediately. Survey flights radiating out from Little America 4 in expanding circles, photographing terrain, taking magnetic readings, charting ice formations, and mountain ranges that had never appeared on any map. My first flight was on January 22nd, a 6-hour mission that took us south along the western edge of the Ross Ice Shelf. And what struck me most was the absolute desolation. Nothing lived down there in the interior. No plants, no animals. Not even the penguins and seals that populated the coast. Just ice and rock and the howling wind that never stopped. The radio crackled with static constantly. Our instruments gave erratic readings, and the fuel in our tanks thickened from the cold despite the heating systems we'd installed. Every flight felt like tempting fate, gambling that our engines wouldn't freeze or our navigation wouldn't fail before we made it back to base. But it was during the third week of operations that we started encountering phenomena that didn't match our briefings or expectations. I was flying with Lieutenant Commander David Bunger, we called him Bunger, on a mapping mission that took us further south than any previous flight, past the Transantarctic Mountains and over the polar plateau, where the ice is thickest and the altitude reaches over 10,000 feet. Our instruments started going haywire around 82 degrees south latitude, compasses spinning randomly, altimeters showing impossible readings, radio communications breaking up into fragments of voices that didn't sound like anyone from our expedition. Bunger tried to raise Little America 4 to report the instrument failures, but all we got back was static laced with what sounded like music, not the swing or big band music popular back home, but something older, stranger, like nothing I'd heard before. Then we saw the warm spot. Our external temperature gauge, which had been reading a steady minus 45 degrees, suddenly jumped to minus 20, then minus 5, then incredibly showed positive 15 degrees Fahrenheit. At 82 degrees south, in the middle of the Antarctic plateau, we were registering temperatures warmer than a spring day in Virginia. Bunger thought the instrument had failed, but I could see the evidence with my own eyes. The ice below us had a different color, less the blinding white of fresh snow, and more the blue-gray of old compressed ice that had been exposed to warmer conditions. And there were cracks, massive fissures in the surface that released plumes of what looked like steam or warm air, creating localized fog banks that shouldn't exist in the driest, coldest desert on Earth. "Ice, we need to investigate this," Bunger said, using my nickname. They called me Ice because I never showed fear or excitement, always kept my voice level and calm regardless of what was happening. "Command needs to see this. Circle around and get lower. I want photographs of those fissures." We descended to 5,000 feet, circling the area where the temperature anomalies were strongest, and that's when we saw it, the opening. At first I thought it was just another crack in the ice, one of the crevasses that lace the Antarctic plateau and can swallow entire expeditions without trace. But as we came around for another pass, I realized this was different. This wasn't a crack. It was an entrance, a canyon that cut down through the ice at an angle, with walls too smooth and too regular to be natural formation. The opening was enormous, easily a quarter-mile wide, descending into darkness that our eyes couldn't penetrate even in the bright Antarctic sun. Bunger immediately tried to radio back to base, but the static had gotten worse, drowning out any attempt at communication. We were on our own, two men in an aircraft hovering over an impossible geological feature that shouldn't exist according to everything we knew about Antarctic topography. "What do you think?" Bunger asked me, and I could hear the tension in his voice despite his training. Could be volcanic vent, geothermal activity that created a collapsed area. Could be the Nazis carved this out somehow, though that would require engineering resources beyond anything we know they possessed. Or, he didn't finish the sentence, didn't want to voice what we were both thinking, that this was related to the lands beyond the pole that Admiral Byrd had mentioned, the anomalous readings that had partially motivated this entire expedition. I made a decision that violated every protocol we'd been given about staying with planned flight paths and not taking unnecessary risks. "We're going down," I said, adjusting our angle and beginning a descent toward the opening. "Whatever this is, Command needs to know about it, and we can't tell them anything useful from 5,000 feet. We have enough fuel for 30 minutes of investigation and still make it back to base with reserve. If we don't like what we see, we pull up and report what we can." Bunger didn't argue. He was thinking the same thing I was, that this discovery was exactly the kind of anomalous feature we'd been sent to investigate, that turning away without examining it would haunt us more than any risk we might take by descending. So we nosed down into the opening, leaving the familiar white landscape of the Antarctic surface behind, and entering a vertical shaft through the ice that should not exist, but clearly, impossibly did. The descent was the most surreal experience of my flying career, and I'd flown combat missions over Japan where anti-aircraft fire turned the sky into a nightmare of exploding metal. The walls of the shaft were ice, but ice unlike anything I'd seen before, smooth as glass, almost translucent in places, with colors running through it in bands of blue and green that created the impression of stained glass in a cathedral. The shaft descended at a steady 45-degree angle, spiraling slightly as it went deeper, wide enough that we never worried about our wings clipping the sides, but narrow enough that we couldn't have turned around if we'd wanted to. The temperature continued to rise. Our gauge showed 30 degrees, then 45, then incredibly 60 degrees Fahrenheit. We were miles below the Antarctic surface in a tunnel through the ice, and it was warmer than most winter days back home in Ohio. After what felt like hours but was probably less than 15 minutes, we saw light ahead, not the reflected sunlight from the surface we'd left behind, but a different quality of light, warmer and more diffuse, as if coming from a source that wasn't the sun. Bunger and I exchanged looks, both of us processing the impossible implications of what that meant. There was illumination below the Antarctic ice sheet, in a space that should have been nothing but frozen darkness. And as we emerged from the bottom of the shaft, as our aircraft broke through into the space beyond, we both fell silent in absolute shock at what lay before us, because spread out below us, impossible and undeniable, was something that would force humanity to redraw every map we'd ever made and rewrite every history book we'd ever written. A world that existed beneath the ice, complete with its own sky, its own light source, its own ocean, and in the distance, structures that could only be described as a city built by beings who had been here long, long before humanity ever looked up at the stars and wondered if we were alone. I need you to understand that what I'm about to describe isn't metaphor or exaggeration or the confused memories of an old man. This is exactly what Bunger and I saw when we emerged from that shaft through the ice. A world. Not a cavern, not a cave system, not some geological anomaly. A complete world existing beneath the Antarctic ice sheet, with its own atmosphere, its own light source, its own weather patterns, and its own horizon that curved upward instead of down, because we were on the inside of a sphere rather than the outside. Every law of physics and geography I'd been taught said this was impossible. And yet, there we were, flying our R-4D aircraft through air that registered 68 degrees Fahrenheit on our instruments, looking out at a landscape that should not exist. The sky above us, and I use the word sky because that's what it looked like, even though we were miles below the Antarctic surface, glowed with a soft, diffuse light that reminded me of an overcast day back home, though the source wasn't the sun. The illumination seemed to come from the air itself, or perhaps from a layer of luminescent clouds or mist that hung in what should have been the center of this hollow space. The light had a slightly golden quality, warmer than sunlight, and it was bright enough to see clearly for miles in every direction. Below us spread an ocean, actual water, liquid and dark blue, with waves creating whitecaps on the surface and what appeared to be currents and tidal patterns. The ocean extended to a horizon that was closer than it should be, and curved in the wrong direction, rising rather than falling away, creating the dizzying optical effect of being inside a bowl or sphere. But what made Bunga actually gasp, and I'd flown combat missions with this man where he never made a sound even when we were taking fire, was the land. Scattered throughout the ocean were land masses, some small like islands, others large enough to be continents in their own right, and they were covered with vegetation. Not the lichens or mosses you might find on the Antarctic coast, but actual forests, dense green growth that from our altitude looked like the jungles of the South Pacific or the forests of the Pacific Northwest. Trees, or something like trees rising hundreds of feet into the air. Valleys of green between mountain ranges that showed bare rock peaks. And strangest of all, what appeared to be structures, geometric shapes that stood out against the natural landscape. Too regular and too massive to be anything but artificial construction. "Ice, tell me you're seeing this," Bunga said, his voice barely above a whisper, even though no one could hear us except each other. "Tell me I haven't lost my mind, and this is actually real." I confirmed I was seeing the same thing he was, though confirmation didn't make it any less impossible to accept. We'd descended through a shaft in the Antarctic ice and emerged inside a hollow space that stretched for hundreds of miles in every direction, a space that contained an entire biosphere that had no business existing in the most hostile environment on Earth. The temperature inside our cockpit had risen to a comfortable 70 degrees. We'd shed our heavy, cold-weather flight gear and were flying in our regular uniforms, sweating from the warmth and the adrenaline of what we were experiencing. I checked our fuel gauge. We'd used nearly a third of our capacity during the descent through the shaft, which meant we had maybe 45 minutes of flight time before we needed to start heading back to the surface if we wanted any safety margin. But the thought of leaving without investigating further, of returning to Little America 4 with a report of an impossible hollow Earth that would either get us committed to psychiatric care or disappeared by military intelligence, neither option was acceptable. "We need to get lower, get visual confirmation of what those structures are," I said, beginning a descent toward the ocean surface. "If this is real, if we're actually inside some kind of hollow space beneath Antarctica, Command needs to know exactly what's down here. We'll spend 30 minutes on reconnaissance and visual documentation, then return to base and let them decide what to do with the information." As we descended to within 1,000 feet of the ocean surface, the details became clearer and more disturbing to everything I thought I understood about our planet. The water below wasn't Arctic cold. It was temperate, possibly tropical based on the color and clarity. We could see shapes moving beneath the surface, large marine creatures that could have been whales or dolphins, but moved in patterns unlike any Earth cetaceans I'd encountered. The vegetation on the islands was lush and varied, with what appeared to be different climate zones despite the uniform lighting. Some islands showed tropical growth, others had more temperate forests, and in the distance I could see what looked like grasslands or savannas. The structures that had caught our attention from higher altitude resolved into something that made my hands tighten on the controls. Ruins, massive architectural remnants that bore the marks of sophisticated civilization. Pyramids, towers, vast complexes of buildings that stretched for miles, all in various states of decay, but clearly the work of intelligent design. But not all of the structures were ruins. As we flew toward the largest landmass we could see, following a coastline that curved impossibly upward into the distance, we spotted a city that was clearly still inhabited. The architecture was like nothing I'd seen in any history book or travel photograph. Towers that rose thousands of feet into the air but were gracefully curved rather than angular. Buildings that seemed to grow organically from the landscape rather than being imposed upon it, and what appeared to be bridges or elevated roadways connecting structures in patterns that created a kind of three-dimensional web of construction. The scale was staggering. This was no small settlement or research outpost. This was a major metropolitan center with a footprint larger than New York City, built with technologies and aesthetic principles that had no correlation to any human civilization I knew of. "There are people down there," Bunga said, adjusting the focus on our camera equipment. "Look at the activity on those elevated roads. Those are vehicles or beings moving in organized patterns. This isn't ancient ruins, Ice. This is an active city. Someone or something lives here right now beneath Antarctica, where no one on the surface knows they exist." I saw what he was pointing at. Movement throughout the city that suggested a populated, functioning civilization. We weren't looking at some archaeological site or abandoned settlement that would revolutionize our understanding of ancient history. We were looking at a contemporary civilization that existed in parallel to our own, hidden beneath miles of ice, and accessible only through passages that weren't marked on any map, because they challenged the fundamental assumption that Earth was a solid sphere. I was about to suggest we circle the city at a safe distance to gather more photographic evidence when our aircraft was suddenly caught in what felt like a tractor beam from a science fiction pulp magazine. I'm using that term because I don't have better language for what happened. We lost control of our plane. The control surfaces stopped responding to my inputs. The engines throttled back to idle without me touching the throttle, and we were gently but firmly guided toward a clearing on the outskirts of the city. It wasn't a crash or forced landing. It was more like being parked by some external force that had taken control of our aircraft with technology so advanced we couldn't even see the mechanism being used. "We're being brought down," I said unnecessarily, stating the obvious while trying every control input I could think of to regain authority over our plane. Nothing worked. We were passengers in our own aircraft, being guided to the ground by whoever or whatever controlled this impossible city. The landing was smoother than most I'd made under my own control. Whoever was guiding us knew exactly what they were doing with our aircraft. Despite it being human technology, they theoretically should never have encountered. We touched down in what appeared to be a park or cultivated garden space, the wheels settling onto grass that was impossibly green and lush for a region that should have been buried under miles of ice. Our engines shut down automatically, the propellers spinning to a stop, and we sat in our cockpit in absolute silence for several seconds, processing what had just happened and what was about to happen next. Through the windscreen, I could see figures approaching, tall, humanoid in general proportion, but clearly not human, moving with a grace and purpose that suggested intelligence and organization. They weren't carrying weapons that I could see, but their presence and the way they'd commandeered our aircraft made it clear we weren't in control of this situation anymore. Bunger and I exchanged looks, both of us understanding without words that we'd just made first contact with a civilization that existed beneath the Antarctic ice, and that everything about our mission, our understanding of Earth, and possibly our survival had just changed in ways we couldn't begin to predict. I need to describe these beings carefully, precisely, because when I tell you they weren't human, I don't want you imagining monsters or aliens from pulp science fiction. They were humanoid, 2 arms, 2 legs, bipedal locomotion, forward-facing eyes, but they were to us what we might be to Neanderthals. Clearly the same general evolutionary template, but refined, adapted, evolved for a different environment and perhaps a different purpose. The first one who approached our aircraft stood approximately 8 feet tall, with a slender build that suggested strength without bulk. The skin was pale, almost translucent in the strange golden light of this interior world, with a faint luminescence beneath the surface, as if the being had bioluminescent qualities. The face was elongated, with a higher cranium than humans possess, suggesting larger brain capacity, and the eyes were enormous, almond-shaped, and completely black with no visible sclera, adapted for low-light conditions in a way that made them simultaneously beautiful and unsettling. Bunger had his hand on his sidearm, not drawing it, but clearly considering the option, when I felt something that made me freeze completely, a presence in my mind that wasn't my own thoughts. It wasn't voice exactly, more like concepts and meanings being inserted directly into my consciousness without passing through language. The sensation was profoundly invasive and yet somehow gentle, like having someone whisper directly into the core of your being. And what I heard, or felt, or understood, was a message that came through with absolute clarity despite having no words. You are not in danger. We mean no harm. Please exit your craft so we may communicate properly and explain what you have discovered. I looked at Bunger and saw his eyes were wide with the same shock I felt. Did you just... he started, and I nodded before he could finish. We'd both received the telepathic communication, both understood it despite it being unlike anything in our experience. I made a decision based on instinct rather than training, because no training existed for this situation. We exit the aircraft slowly, hands visible, no aggressive movements, I said quietly. If they wanted us dead, we'd already be dead. They controlled our plane with technology we don't understand and landed us gently instead of crashing us. That suggests they want to talk, not fight. And besides, I gestured at the beings who had gathered around our aircraft. There were now 6 of them, all similar in appearance but with variations in height and skin tone. We're outnumbered and outmatched. Our best option is cooperation and information gathering. We climbed down from the R4D onto grass that felt impossibly soft and real beneath our boots after weeks of nothing but ice and snow. The air smelled different than surface air, cleaner somehow, with a scent like ozone mixed with something floral I couldn't identify. The temperature was perfect, what I'd call room temperature if we were indoors. But we were standing in open air beneath a glowing sky inside a hollow beneath Antarctica, surrounded by beings who looked like they'd stepped out of mythology or dreams. The tallest of the Antaran, I didn't know to call them that yet, stepped forward and extended a hand in a gesture that was clearly meant to be reassuring, despite the fingers being longer and more delicate than human proportions. When I hesitated, the telepathic voice came again, clearer now that we were in proximity. "We understand your customs of greeting. We have observed your people for a very long time." The moment I took that offered hand, I experienced something that would have seemed impossible 5 minutes earlier, but which I now accepted as simply one more impossibility in a day full of them: a data transfer. Not through words or images, but direct mind-to-mind transmission of information, concepts, and history flowing from this being's consciousness into my own. I learned their name for themselves, Antaran, meaning those who came before, in a language older than any human tongue. I understood that this wasn't first contact in the sense humanity usually imagined it. They had been aware of surface humans for thousands of years, had occasionally interacted with us during our early civilizations, and had made a deliberate choice to withdraw to this interior realm when the last ice age had devastated the surface world. And most significantly, I understood why they'd brought us down here now, because what was happening on the surface world had implications for their survival in the interior, and they needed surface governments to understand what was at stake. The Antaran who had made contact, I would later learn their designation was something like Meridian, the closest translation we could manage, gestured for us to follow, and began walking toward the city. Bunga and I exchanged looks, both understanding we had no real choice but to comply, and both recognizing this as possibly the most significant moment in human history, even if no one on the surface would ever know it happened. As we walked, Meridian continued the telepathic communication, and I felt my understanding of their civilization expanding with each step. The city we approached was called something that translated roughly to Luminara, and it had stood in this location for over 12,000 years, longer than all of recorded human history. It was one of 7 major population centers in this interior realm, connected by what I understood to be transportation networks that moved through the Earth itself, using principles of physics we hadn't discovered. The architecture as we got closer was even more impressive and alien than it had appeared from the air. The buildings weren't constructed in the sense of being assembled from separate materials. They appeared to have been grown or shaped from some kind of crystalline substance that was simultaneously stone and something more organic. Surfaces rippled with patterns that might have been decorative or might have been functional, and I could see what appeared to be energy or light, moving through structures in ways that suggested the entire city was a kind of living system, rather than dead construction. The Antaran who populated the streets, and there were hundreds of them visible now, moved with fluid grace, wearing clothing that seemed to shift color and texture based on light and movement. Some stopped to observe us with those enormous black eyes, but none showed fear or hostility, only curiosity about the surface dwellers who had stumbled into their world. Meridian led us to a building near the city center that was larger and more ornate than the others, with what appeared to be symbols or writing carved into its crystalline surface in scripts that looked nothing like any human language. Inside, the space opened into a vast chamber lit by that same sourceless golden light, with what I can only describe as a council or assembly waiting for us. 12 Antarans sat in a semicircle arrangement, all of them radiating an impression of age and authority that made it clear these were their leaders or elders. As Bunga and I stood before them, trying to maintain military bearing despite being completely out of our depth, the collective telepathic presence of 12 advanced minds focusing on us simultaneously was overwhelming. It felt like standing in a spotlight made of pure consciousness, every thought and emotion laid bare before beings who could read us as easily as we might read a book. The communication that followed wasn't a conversation in any normal sense. It was a transmission, a download of information they needed us to understand and carry back to the surface. They showed us their history, how their civilization had thrived on the outer surface of Earth during what human archaeology calls the Younger Dryas period, approximately 12,000 years ago. They showed us their great cities that had spanned continents, their technology that had allowed them to shape matter and energy in ways we were only beginning to theorize about, and their catastrophic mistake, experiments with planetary energy systems that had triggered the very cataclysm that destroyed them. The massive flooding, the sudden climate shifts, the extinction of megafauna that human science attributed to natural climate change, all of it was actually the result of their technological failure, a desperate attempt to stabilize Earth's magnetic field that instead disrupted it catastrophically. The survivors, a fraction of their original civilization, had retreated to these hollow spaces within Earth that they'd discovered but never fully utilized, spaces created by geological processes we didn't understand and that their science barely comprehended. They'd sealed the entrances, created this interior ecosystem using what remained of their technology, and watched from below as new human civilizations arose on the surface, primitive and ignorant of the advanced culture that had come before. And they'd made a choice to remain hidden, to let surface humanity develop independently without interference, to exist as silent observers of a world they'd once dominated but could never reclaim. That choice had held for 12 millennia, through the rise and fall of countless human civilizations, through our Industrial Revolution and our world wars and our atomic age. But now, Meridian's telepathic voice carried weight and urgency as the Council transmitted their final message. Something had changed that forced them to break their silence. We surface humans, in our ignorance and our technological adolescence, were about to make the same mistake they had made 12,000 years ago. And if we succeeded, it would destroy not just our surface world, but their interior realm as well. The nuclear testing we'd been conducting, the atomic weapons we'd developed with such pride and such fear, these were destabilizing the planetary energy systems in exactly the way their own experiments had done before, and time was running out to prevent a repetition of the cataclysm that had ended their age and could end ours. The Council of 12 didn't just tell us their history through telepathic transmission. They showed us proof, physical evidence that would have rewritten every archaeology textbook and history curriculum if it had ever reached the surface world. Meridian guided us from the council chamber to what I can only describe as a museum or archive, though those words don't capture the scale or sophistication of what we encountered. The building stretched for what must have been miles, with corridors branching in all directions, each one containing artifacts and displays from different eras of Antaran civilization. But what stopped me dead in my tracks, what made Bunga actually grab my arm to steady himself, was the first exhibit we came to, a three-dimensional holographic map of Earth as it had existed 15,000 years ago, before the cataclysm, and the geography was completely wrong according to everything we'd been taught. The continents were in different positions, not dramatically different, but shifted enough that coastlines didn't match modern maps. What we call the Atlantic Ocean was narrower, with a massive landmass occupying space between what is now Europe and the Americas. Antarctica, our Antarctica, the frozen wasteland we'd flown thousands of miles to explore, was shown as a temperate continent with minimal ice coverage, covered in cities and infrastructure that suggested it had been a major center of Antaran civilization. The Mediterranean was a series of interconnected lakes rather than a sea. The Black Sea didn't exist yet, and most shocking of all, the map showed these hollow interior spaces we currently occupied, marked clearly as populated zones connected to the surface by dozens of openings located at strategic points around the planet, not just at the poles, but in the Himalayas, under the Atlantic, beneath the Sahara, in regions that were now sealed or buried by geological changes but which had once served as transit points between surface and interior civilizations. Your archaeologists know something happened approximately 12,000 years ago, Meridian's telepathic voice explained as we studied the impossible map. They call it the Younger Dryas Impact Hypothesis, or the end of the last ice age. They found evidence of massive flooding, rapid climate change, extinction of megafauna, and the sudden emergence of agriculture and civilization in multiple locations simultaneously. What they don't understand is that all of this was result of our civilization's collapse. The floods were caused by the rapid melting of ice sheets when planetary energy systems destabilized. The extinctions were caused by that same destabilization affecting Earth's magnetic field and cosmic radiation protection. And the sudden emergence of agriculture in your Fertile Crescent, in the Indus Valley, in China, in Mesoamerica. Those were our survivors, Antaran who had been living on the surface, teaching the primitive humans who had survived the cataclysm how to cultivate crops and build permanent settlements. The next chamber contained something that made my hands shake. Artifacts from what Meridian identified as Antaran cities that had existed on the surface before the cataclysm, mixed with objects from early human civilizations that showed clear influence or direct contact. There were tools made from alloys that shouldn't have existed in the Stone Age. Astronomical instruments that required mathematical knowledge supposedly not developed until ancient Greece, and most disturbing tablets covered in writing that looked eerily similar to Sumerian cuneiform, Egyptian hieroglyphics, and Mayan glyphs, but predating all of them by thousands of years. Your ancient civilizations didn't develop writing independently, Meridian explained. They learned it from us, from Antaran survivors who emerged from the interior to help surface humans rebuild after the cataclysm. The similarities you notice between unconnected ancient writing systems exist because they all derive from our original script, simplified and adapted by different human cultures, but sharing a common ancestor that your linguists have never been able to identify. Bunger was documenting everything with the camera equipment we'd brought, though I suspected that film and photographs would never be allowed to leave this place. Still, he worked with professional discipline, recording evidence that would prove what we were witnessing if anyone on the surface ever had the chance to see it. The next exhibit literally took my breath away. A scale model of one of their surface cities as it had existed 14,000 years ago, before the cataclysm. The architecture was magnificent. Pyramidal structures that dwarfed anything built by Egypt or Mesoamerica, elevated platforms supporting buildings that reached hundreds of feet into the air, canals and waterways that suggested sophisticated hydraulic engineering, and at the center of the city, what appeared to be a massive crystal or technological device that Meridian identified as a planetary resonance harmonizer, one of the very technologies that had ultimately destroyed their civilization when they'd miscalibrated it trying to prevent a magnetic pole shift. The Great Pyramid of Giza, Meridian's voice came with weight of ancient regret, was built by early human civilization attempting to recreate our structures from memory and from plans that survivors had shown them. But humans didn't understand the purpose. You thought you were building tombs for kings, when actually you were trying to reconstruct our energy-focusing systems without comprehending the principles behind them. That's why your pyramids are empty of the technology they were designed to house. You built the shell without understanding the mechanism it was meant to contain. The model showed power conduits running through the pyramid structure, connecting to underground chambers far more extensive than anything modern archaeology had found, and suggesting that the pyramids we knew from Egypt and Central America were just the visible portions of much larger systems that extended deep into the earth. The evidence continued, chamber after chamber of artifacts and displays that systematically dismantled human history as we understood it. They showed us Antaran navigation devices that had been recovered from what they called teaching sites, locations where their survivors had established settlements to educate surface humans. I recognized some of the locations from archaeology: Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, Puma Punku in Bolivia, the underwater structures off the coast of Japan that conventional archaeology dismisses as natural formation, but which Meridian confirmed were remnants of Antaran coastal installations. Atlantis was not a myth, Meridian explained, anticipating the question forming in my mind. It was the name your Greek historian Plato recorded for one of our major population centers, located on a continental shelf in the Atlantic that has since subsided. The story of its destruction in a single day and night is accurate. When our planetary energy systems collapsed, the tectonic instabilities caused that landmass to sink catastrophically, exactly as your legends describe. But the most unsettling exhibit was the final chamber, which contained evidence of ongoing Antaran contact with surface civilizations throughout human history. There were artifacts from ancient Sumeria showing clearly Antaran design, statues from Egypt depicting beings with elongated heads and large eyes that matched Antaran physiology exactly, Mayan carvings showing what were obviously spacecraft or advanced vehicles, and most disturbing to me personally, objects from much more recent human history. Medallions and jewelry from medieval Europe bearing Antaran symbols, documents from Renaissance secret societies showing architectural plans that could only have come from Antaran sources, and photographs, actual photographs from the late 1800s and early 1900s, showing Antaran individuals among humans, disguised with clothing and posture that concealed their true nature, but clearly identifiable to anyone who knew what to look for. "We have never completely withdrawn," Meridian explained, showing us an image that made my blood run cold. A photograph from 1938 showing a Nazi expedition in Antarctica, and among the German officers, standing slightly apart but clearly part of the group, an individual who was unmistakably Antaran despite the heavy clothing. Your German National Socialist movement made contact with us in the 1930s. They had been seeking us, guided by secret societies that had preserved fragments of knowledge about the interior worlds. We made a mistake. Some of our number believed we could work with them, could guide them away from their destructive path by sharing limited knowledge. Instead, they attempted to use what we showed them to build weapons, to claim our technology for purposes of conquest. We severed contact in 1941, but not before they learned of the Antarctic passages, not before they established bases near some of the openings. That is why your military sent you here, looking for Nazi installations. What they don't know is that the Nazis found something far more significant than bases. They found us. The final transmission Meridian shared was the most urgent and the most terrifying. Real-time data showing what human nuclear testing was doing to planetary systems. He showed us holographic displays of Earth's magnetic field being disrupted by atomic detonations, showed us stress patterns in the planet's crust that were building toward catastrophic tectonic releases, showed us energy signatures from our weapons that were resonating with the same planetary frequencies that had destroyed Antaran civilization 12,000 years ago. Your Manhattan Project scientists understood they were splitting the atom. Meridian's telepathic voice carried desperate urgency. What they didn't understand was that atomic fission at the scales you're conducting creates ripples in the fundamental energy matrix of the planet itself. You've detonated 2 weapons in warfare and dozens in testing. Each one brings you closer to the threshold where planetary systems will cascade into failure. Our calculations suggest you have perhaps 10 to 15 years before you cross that threshold. After that, the same cataclysm that destroyed our surface civilization will destroy yours, and this time, the interior realms will not survive the collapse. Both of our worlds will end unless your surface governments stop the testing and dismantle the weapons you've built. That is why we broke 12,000 years of silence to make contact. Not because we want to interfere with your development, but because your ignorance threatens to kill everyone on this planet, surface and interior alike. After showing us the evidence of their civilization and the dire warning about nuclear weapons, Meridian made an offer that I didn't expect. There is something else you need to see before you return to your surface world. Something that will help your commanders understand why we are revealing ourselves now, and why the threat is more immediate than they might believe. Your Nazi forces, the ones you came here searching for, they did establish a base in Antarctica, but not on the surface where you've been looking. They found one of the secondary passages to the interior, a smaller opening than the one you descended through, and they built their installation just inside that threshold. It has been abandoned for 2 years now, since we forced them to withdraw, but the evidence of what they attempted remains. You need to see it, so you can report to your superiors exactly how close your species came to accessing technology you are not prepared to possess. Bunga and I exchanged worried glances. The idea that we were about to visit a Nazi base inside a hollow Earth was surreal, even after everything we'd already witnessed. Meridian led us back to our R4D aircraft, which had been refueled. I have no idea how, with what, or when, but our tanks were full again, and instructed us to follow a vehicle that I can only describe as a flying craft that operated on principles completely unlike our propeller-driven planes. It was disc-shaped, maybe 30 feet in diameter, with no visible engines or control surfaces, and it moved with impossible agility and silence. Your militaries have been seeing our vehicles for years, Meridian's telepathic voice explained. You call them Foo Fighters and flying saucers. We monitor your surface activities, particularly your weapons development, and sometimes our craft are detected. Usually we can avoid your detection systems, but occasionally we allow ourselves to be seen, hoping to make your governments question their assumptions about being alone in the universe. We flew for what my instruments indicated was approximately 400 miles, following the Antaran craft through the interior atmosphere, past other islands and landmasses that I desperately wanted to explore but knew we didn't have time for. The geography of this interior world followed patterns I was beginning to understand. The surface curved upward in all directions because we were inside a sphere, with the luminescent sky or atmosphere providing constant ambient light from the center. The Antaran craft led us to a region where the interior surface rose into mountain ranges that reminded me of the Alps or the Rockies, and there, carved into the side of what appeared to be a volcanic peak, was an entrance that was clearly artificial and clearly built with human engineering principles rather than Antaran elegance. Concrete reinforcements, metal doors partially ajar, and most damning of all, symbols I recognized immediately: the swastika and the SS lightning bolts of Nazi Germany, painted on the walls in fading paint. We landed our R4D on a plateau near the entrance, and this time we exited with weapons drawn, because whatever waited inside that installation was human in origin and potentially hostile, even if it had been abandoned. The Antaran craft deposited Meridian and 2 other Antaran who had accompanied us, and together, our mixed group approached the Nazi base with caution that proved unnecessary. The place was a tomb, abandoned and silent, with no signs of recent activity. But the evidence of what had happened here was preserved in horrifying detail. The entrance corridor led into a complex that had been carved into the mountain with brutal efficiency, rooms and laboratories, and storage facilities that showed clear German engineering and organization. And everywhere, documentation, files, photographs, journals, technical diagrams that told the story of what the Nazis had been attempting in this forsaken place. The base had been designated Neuschwabenland Station Alpha, and according to the logs we found, it had been operational from 1942 to 1945, staffed by a rotating crew of scientists, SS officers, and technical personnel who had been shuttled in through submarine operations to the Antarctic coast and then guided through a passage to this interior location. The mission logs were explicit about their objectives: establish contact with what they called the Ancient Ones, the Antaran, acquire their technology through negotiation or force, and develop weapons systems that would ensure German victory even as the war on the surface turned against them. The arrogance of it was staggering. These men genuinely believed they could threaten or manipulate beings whose civilization was thousands of years older and technologically superior, simply because Nazi ideology taught them they were racially superior to all other forms of life. What disturbed me more than the base itself was the evidence of what they'd been working on in the laboratories. We found experimental weapons that attempted to replicate Antaran energy systems, cobbled together from stolen or traded technology with German engineering in ways that were clearly unstable and dangerous. One room contained what appeared to be a prototype flying disc, maybe 20 feet in diameter, built from metal alloys I didn't recognize, and incorporating components that looked Antaran in origin. According to the technical notes scattered around it, the craft had achieved brief flight, but had crashed during testing, killing 2 pilots and destroying a section of the base. The Nazi engineers had been trying to reverse engineer Antaran propulsion systems without understanding the fundamental physics, like medieval blacksmiths trying to build a jet engine after seeing one fly overhead. But the most damning evidence was in what the logs called the negotiation records, transcripts of meetings between SS officers and Antaran representatives that had occurred between 1942 and 1944. I sat in that abandoned office, reading typed pages in German that Meridian helped me translate telepathically, and felt sick at what I was learning. The Nazis had offered the Antaran a deal. In exchange for technology and knowledge, they would help the Antaran eliminate what the Nazis called racial inferiors from the surface population, leaving only what they considered genetically superior humans to rebuild civilization under joint Nazi-Antaran guidance. They actually believed the Antaran would be interested in their eugenics programs, would see value in Nazi ideology about racial purity, would want to collaborate in genocide. The transcripts showed Antaran representatives listening to these proposals with what I imagine was appalled fascination before ultimately refusing and severing all contact. "This was our mistake." Meridian's telepathic voice carried weight of shame as we explored the base. Some of our council believed that surface humans had evolved enough to be trusted with knowledge of our existence. They thought your German scientists, who had clearly been searching for us based on esoteric knowledge preserved by their secret societies, might be the right contact point. We were wrong. Their ideology was so twisted, so fundamentally opposed to cooperative existence, that sharing anything with them was dangerous. When they refused to accept our refusal to help them, when they attempted to steal technology by force and even tried to capture one of our citizens for interrogation, we were forced to take action. In 1945, we destroyed several of their submarines that were attempting to transport stolen materials to the surface, and we sealed the passage they had been using. That's why their base was abandoned. Not because Germany lost the war on the surface, though that happened too, but because we cut off their access to the interior. The final room we explored was the most disturbing, a chamber the Nazis had designated as intelligence analysis, filled with maps and photographs and documents that showed they'd been spying on the interior world with equipment positioned at the entrance passage. They'd photographed Antaran cities from a distance, had documented migration patterns and resource movements, had even identified what they thought were military installations or defensive structures. The analysis was wrong in most details. Nazi observers were trying to understand an alien civilization through the lens of their own fascist militarism, but it was thorough enough to be dangerous. If this information had made it back to the surface, if it had been shared with post-war German scientists who ended up working for the Americans or Soviets, the knowledge that a hollow Earth with advanced civilization existed could have changed the entire trajectory of the Cold War. But what made my hands shake as I examined those files was finding photographs of people I recognized. Admiral Byrd himself, along with other members of our Operation Highjump command staff, photographed from a distance during our early reconnaissance flights over Antarctica. The Nazis had been monitoring our expedition, had known we were coming, and had left booby traps and false trails designed to lead us to their abandoned base. Except we'd found it through a different route, not by their design, but through Antaran intervention. The final log entry in the base, dated March 3, 1945, confirmed what Meridian had told us. Access to the interior realm is now sealed by forces we cannot overcome. All personnel ordered to evacuate to fallback positions. Project Neuschwabenland is terminated. God help us all. The Nazi expedition to Antarctica had ended not because they'd been defeated by Allied forces, but because they'd angered beings who could simply close doors they'd thought were permanent and leave them stranded on the wrong side. What I learned later, what Meridian confirmed as we prepared to leave the abandoned base, was even more disturbing. Not all the Nazis had evacuated. Some of the senior leadership, the true believers who thought they could still negotiate with the Antaran, or who refused to return to a surface world where Germany had lost, had gone deeper into the interior rather than returning to the surface. Meridian's people had allowed it, had even guided them to a remote region where they could establish a small settlement, isolated and monitored but permitted to live out their days. There is a valley, 3,000 miles from here, where approximately 200 of your German nationals have lived since 1945, Meridian explained. They are aging, dying, their settlement failing. We do not help them because we do not forget what they attempted, but we do not kill them either, because that would make us what they accused us of being. In another generation, they will be extinct, and their failed colony will be just another ruin in the interior world. We tell you this so your surface governments know. Some of your missing war criminals did not escape to South America. They escaped to a place you can never reach them. After we documented everything in the Nazi base that we could photograph and record, Meridian led us back to our aircraft with a gravity that suggested the most critical part of our encounter was still to come. The Antaran craft escorted us back to Luminara, and there we were brought before the full Council of 12 once more. This time, the telepathic communication wasn't just information transfer. It was a formal diplomatic message, carefully structured and precisely worded, meant to be delivered to the highest levels of surface government. What they transmitted to us over the next 2 hours was essentially an ultimatum wrapped in courtesy, a warning delivered by beings who held technological superiority, but were choosing negotiation over confrontation, at least for now. Captain Callahan, Lieutenant Commander Bunger, the collective voice of the council resonated in our minds. You will return to your surface world and deliver this message to your military commanders, who will deliver it to your political leaders, who will share it, in controlled fashion, with the leaders of other surface nations. The message is this: your species has reached a critical threshold in its technological development. The atomic weapons you have created and deployed are more dangerous than you understand, not because of their immediate destructive capacity, though that is terrible enough, but because of their effects on planetary energy systems that your science has not yet discovered. We know this because we made the same mistake 12,000 years ago. We built weapons that harnessed fundamental forces of nature, and in using them, we destabilized the very planetary systems that maintain stable climate, magnetic fields, and tectonic balance. The result was a cataclysm that destroyed our surface civilization and nearly rendered Earth uninhabitable for any complex life. The Council showed us more holographic displays, this time depicting in horrifying detail what would happen if nuclear testing continued at current rates. They showed Earth's magnetic field collapsing within 15 years, allowing solar radiation to strip away the atmosphere in a matter of decades. They showed massive tectonic shifts as the planet's internal energy systems became destabilized, with volcanic eruptions and earthquakes of magnitudes that would make the 1906 San Francisco quake look like a minor tremor. They showed flooding that would make the biblical deluge seem modest by comparison, as polar ice melted rapidly and ocean levels rose hundreds of feet. And they showed what would happen to the interior world, their cities crushed by collapsing geology, their carefully maintained atmospheric systems failing, their civilization dying not from any enemy but from the unintended consequences of surface humanity's ignorant weapons development. We offer you a choice, the Council continued, their telepathic voice allowing no room for misinterpretation. You may continue on your current path of nuclear weapons development, testing, and eventual deployment in warfare. If you do, our calculations give you between 10 and 15 years before the cascade of planetary failures becomes irreversible. When that threshold is crossed, both your surface civilization and our interior civilization will end, and Earth will become a dead world for at least 10,000 years. Or, you may accept our guidance and assistance in dismantling these weapons systems, redirecting your technological development along paths that do not threaten planetary stability, and beginning a careful, controlled process of revealing to your surface populations that they are not alone on this planet. We prefer the second option, but we will not force it. We have learned from our own history that forcing evolutionary changes on civilizations that are not ready leads to disaster. The choice must be yours. Bunger, who had been mostly silent during our entire encounter with the Antaran, finally spoke aloud, the first spoken words rather than telepathic communication in ours. And if our governments refuse, if they decide the strategic advantage of nuclear weapons is worth the risk you're describing? The Council's response was immediate and chilling. Then we will be forced to take protective measures. We will seal all passages between interior and surface permanently. We will ensure our civilization survives in isolation, even as yours destroys itself. We would prefer not to abandon you to that fate, but we will not allow your ignorance to kill our children and end our civilization. This is not a threat. It is a statement of survival necessity. We hope your leaders are wise enough to choose cooperation over extinction. They gave us physical evidence to take back, technological devices that they said would prove the validity of our encounter to any scientist or engineer who examined them with proper equipment. Small crystalline objects that generated more power than any battery our technology could produce, made from materials that didn't appear in any periodic table we knew, operating on principles that would challenge every physics textbook written. Your scientists will not be able to replicate these, Meridian explained, but they will be able to verify that they function, that they violate known physical laws, and that they therefore must come from a source with understanding beyond your current capabilities. Let that serve as proof that what you report is not delusion or fabrication, but encounter with genuine non-human intelligence that has been sharing this planet with you since before your species learned to write. Then came the part that I knew would doom me to a lifetime of silence and surveillance. They asked us to make a personal choice. We have given you the formal message for your governments, the Council said, but we also offer you an individual decision. You may request to remain here, to study with us, to learn our history and science and philosophy, and to never return to the surface world. Some humans over the millennia have made this choice. Surface dwellers who stumbled into the interior and decided the knowledge they could gain was worth abandoning their previous lives. We would grant you that opportunity if you wish it. Or you may return to your world, knowing that you will be required to keep most of what you've learned secret, that your governments will use the threat of imprisonment or worse to ensure your silence, and that you will likely live the rest of your lives unable to speak freely about the most significant experience you've ever had. I looked at Bunger, saw the same conflict in his eyes that I felt in my gut. The temptation to stay was profound, to learn from beings whose civilization spanned millennia, to understand technologies and philosophies that surface humans wouldn't develop for centuries, if we survived that long. But we both knew what our answer had to be. "We have people waiting for us on the surface," I said aloud, needing to hear my own voice make the commitment. "Families, friends, a world that's ours despite its flaws. If we stay here, we abandon them to face whatever's coming without the warning you've asked us to deliver. That's not a choice we can make. We go back." The Council's telepathic response carried what I interpreted as approval or respect. "You choose loyalty over knowledge. That is admirable, though we suspect you will regret it in the decades to come. Very well. We will provide you with fuel and supplies for your return journey, and we will guide you back to the passage you originally descended through. Once you reach the surface, you will find that less time has passed than you experienced here. The interior world's temporal relationship to the surface is not one-to-one due to gravitational and rotational differences. You will have been missing for perhaps 30 hours rather than the 3 days you've spent with us." The farewell was surprisingly emotional. Meridian accompanied us back to our aircraft, and as we prepared for departure, the telepathic communication became personal rather than formal. "Robert Callahan," Meridian's voice carried warmth that surprised me. "You and David Bunger have shown more courage and openness than most surface humans we've encountered in recent centuries. If your species survives the crisis ahead, it will be because of people like you who can see beyond their own cultural assumptions and recognize that the universe is stranger and more wonderful than your philosophies have dreamed. We will watch your progress with hope, and perhaps in your lifetime, there will come a day when contact between our peoples is not secret and forbidden, but open and celebrated. Until then, know that you carry our trust, as well as our message." We took off from Luminara with our aircraft loaded with evidence, and our minds loaded with knowledge that would haunt us for the rest of our lives. The flight back through the interior world gave us one last chance to see the impossible beauty of it. The ocean stretching to an upward curving horizon, the islands covered in forests that had never known winter, the cities that gleamed with technologies we couldn't understand, all bathed in that sourceless golden light that created perpetual twilight. Bunger was crying silently as he piloted, and I understood why. We were leaving paradise, or at least leaving something that challenged everything we thought we knew about our planet and our place in the cosmos, and we were returning to a surface world that would never believe us, that would classify and bury and deny everything we'd experienced. The ascent through the passage was easier than the descent had been, perhaps because the Antaran were actively assisting our navigation with their technology. We climbed through miles of ice, watching the temperature drop back to brutal Antarctic cold, watching the light fade from warm gold to harsh white as we approached the surface. And then we broke through into the familiar Antarctic sky, emerging from the same opening we'd descended through days earlier, and I felt a crushing sense of loss despite the relief of survival. We'd been to another world, and now we were back in ours, and nothing would ever be the same, even though everything would have to appear unchanged. We turned our aircraft toward Little America 4, composing our official report in our heads. How much to include, how to frame the incredible so it wouldn't be dismissed as insanity, how to convince Admiral Byrd and the mission commanders that they needed to abort the expedition immediately and get this information to Washington before it was too late. We had maybe an hour of flight time before we'd have to face that challenge, and in that hour, Bunger turned to me and said something that I would remember for the next 77 years. "Ice, whatever happens when we land, whatever they do to us or make us say or don't let us say, we saw it. It was real. We went inside the Earth and met beings who remember the last ice age, and we have to find a way to make sure that truth survives even if we don't." I promised him we would. I kept that promise by surviving long enough to make this recording. Whether I succeeded in making the truth survive, you'll have to judge for yourselves after you hear how our surface government responded to the warning we delivered. We landed at Little America 4, 31 hours after we'd taken off, which, from the base's perspective, was within normal parameters for an extended reconnaissance mission, though our fuel consumption was impossible given the distance we'd supposedly traveled and the time we'd been gone. The first person to meet us on the ice was Admiral Byrd himself, and I saw in his eyes that he knew something extraordinary had happened even before we said a word. "Captain Callahan, Commander Bunger," he said quietly, his breath creating clouds of steam in the -40-degree air. "I need you to come with me immediately. No talking to the other crew members, no filing standard mission reports. We have a secure location prepared for your debriefing, and it needs to happen now, before you have time to compare stories or convince yourselves that what you experienced was anything other than what it actually was. That's when I understood. This wasn't the first time. Admiral Byrd himself had encountered the Antaran during one of his earlier expeditions, probably in the 1920s or 1930s, and that's why he'd been selected to lead Operation Highjump. The entire mission had been designed around the possibility that someone would make contact, and protocols were already in place for handling that eventuality. We were escorted to a prefabricated building that had been set up away from the main base facilities, heavily guarded, with communication equipment that looked far more sophisticated than standard military radio gear. Inside waited 3 men I'd never seen before, wearing civilian clothes but carrying themselves with military bearing. No names were offered, no agency affiliations, just instructions to tell us everything that happened from the moment you detected the thermal anomaly until the moment you landed here. The debriefing lasted 18 hours. They questioned us separately first, trying to catch inconsistencies in our stories or evidence that we'd fabricated the encounter. But our accounts matched perfectly, not because we'd rehearsed them, but because we'd actually experienced the same impossible things and were reporting them as accurately as we could. Then they brought us together and went through everything again, this time with technical specialists asking about the physics of the interior world, the architecture of Antaran cities, the specifics of their warning about nuclear weapons. They examined the crystalline devices the Antaran had given us, running tests with equipment I didn't recognize, and I watched their faces go from skepticism to shock as the readings confirmed that these objects were generating power through processes that violated known physics. Admiral Byrd sat in on the final session, and when we'd finished our account, he shared something that explained the urgency and secrecy surrounding everything. Gentlemen, what you encountered is not new information to the United States government, or to several other governments that have been exploring Antarctica over the past century. I myself made contact with the Antaran in 1929, during my first Antarctic expedition. I flew over the pole and descended through a passage similar to the one you found, and I spent 3 days in their world learning what you learned. When I returned and reported what I'd discovered, I was told in no uncertain terms that the information was to be classified at the highest level and never publicly discussed. I was allowed to continue my polar expeditions as cover for monitoring Antaran activity and maintaining communication channels, but I was forbidden from revealing the truth about what exists beneath the ice. He pulled out a folder containing photographs that made my breath catch, images from the 1920s and 1930s showing Antaran cities, showing the same council chamber we'd stood in, showing technology and architecture identical to what Bunger and I had just documented. The Nazis learned about the interior world from esoteric societies that had preserved fragments of ancient knowledge, Byrd continued. When they sent their expedition here in 1938 to 39, they were specifically looking for the entrances that old maps and texts hinted at. They found them, made contact with the Antaran, and tried to negotiate an alliance. That's why Germany suddenly had advanced aircraft designs in the 1940s that seemed to come from nowhere. They were attempting to reverse engineer Antaran technology from the limited access they'd been granted before the Antaran realized the Nazis' true nature and cut off contact. One of the civilian interrogators, I later learned he was from a newly formed agency that would eventually become the CIA, leaned forward with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. Captain Callahan, the devices you brought back prove that the Antaran have technology far beyond anything we or the Soviets possess. The question we need answered is this: can that technology be weaponized? Can we use knowledge from the interior world to build weapons that would give us decisive advantage in the emerging Cold War with Russia? I felt sick at the question, remembering Meridian's warnings about exactly this kind of thinking. Sir, the entire point of their message is that weaponizing advanced technology is what destroyed their civilization and will destroy ours if we continue down that path. They're offering to help us avoid that fate, but only if we abandon the nuclear arms race and agree to controlled development of technologies that don't threaten planetary stability. The CIA man's expression made clear what he thought of that proposal. Captain, the Soviet Union is not going to abandon nuclear weapons development because ancient beings living inside the Earth ask them to. If we unilaterally disarm or even slow our programs based on this warning, we hand strategic advantage to an enemy that would use it to destroy us. The question is not whether the Antaran are right about the dangers. The question is whether we can acquire their technology quickly enough to maintain superiority over our adversaries regardless of those dangers. I looked at Admiral Byrd, hoping for support, but his face showed resigned acceptance. He'd fought this battle before, decades earlier, and he'd lost. The government had decided that national security trumped planetary security, and nothing was going to change that calculus. The interrogation continued with questions about the Nazi base, about the evidence we'd seen of German operations in the interior, about the revelation that some Nazi leadership might still be alive in interior settlements. This information seemed to interest them more than the warnings about nuclear weapons, because it suggested that war criminals they'd been hunting for 2 years were beyond reach in a place that conventional military forces couldn't access. If we wanted to mount an expedition to extract these Nazis from their interior settlement, could it be done? One interrogator asked. I explained what Meridian had told us about the settlement being 3,000 miles from the nearest accessible passage in terrain that would require Antaran technology to navigate, and that the Antaran would never permit such an expedition because it would violate the neutrality of their interior spaces. So they're harboring war criminals. That's an interesting diplomatic position. Cooperative surface. As the debriefing, the tone shifted to threat, specifically assessing their bunker security who needed permanent silence or whether we trusted to maintain the classification. You've been exposed to information that, if revealed publicly, would cause incalculable damage to national security, social stability, and scientific understanding, one of the unnamed civilians explained. Every aspect of what you encountered, the hollow Earth, the Antaran civilization, their technology, their warnings about nuclear weapons, all of it must remain classified under penalties that include life imprisonment or execution for treason. You will sign documents to that effect. You will undergo regular psychological evaluation to ensure you're not developing urges to reveal what you know. And you will be assigned to positions where we can monitor your activities and associations for the rest of your careers. They separated Bunger and me after that, and I didn't see him again for 3 weeks, until we were both back in the United States and assigned to different bases on opposite coasts. The message was clear. Our friendship, forged in the most extraordinary experience 2 humans could share, was a security risk because we might encourage each other to speak about what we'd seen. Over the next months, I would learn that Operation Highjump was being terminated early, officially due to harsh weather conditions and equipment failures. Unofficially because the mission had achieved its primary objective of confirming Antaran presence and assessing the security implications. We'd deployed 4,700 men and 33 aircraft to Antarctica, but only a handful of us had actually encountered what we'd been sent to investigate, and all of us were now locked into a conspiracy of silence that would last the rest of our lives. The final part of my debriefing came from Admiral Byrd himself, in a private conversation that haunts me still. Captain Callahan, I'm going to tell you something that isn't in any classified document, something that I've carried alone for 18 years. The Antaran are right about everything they warned you about. I've seen their calculations. I've had their scientists explain the physics to me, and I understand that nuclear weapons testing is going to trigger a planetary catastrophe within our lifetimes. I've reported this to every administration since 1929, and every one of them has made the same decision. The strategic value of nuclear weapons outweighs the existential risk the Antaran describe. They believe the Antaran are exaggerating or mistaken, or they simply don't care, because the catastrophe is decades away, and political careers are measured in years. So we're going to keep testing, keep building, keep escalating, and we're going to cross the threshold the Antaran warned about. And when it happens, when the planet starts to destabilize and civilization begins to collapse, the men who made these decisions will be dead, and we'll be the ones left to watch the world end, knowing we could have prevented it, but were ordered to stay silent. That's the burden you've inherited today, Captain. I'm sorry. I wish I could have spared you from it. I need to tell you about the cost of keeping this secret for 77 years, because it's not just the knowledge that weighs on you. It's watching everyone who shared that knowledge disappear one by one, until you're the last man standing in a conspiracy that has lasted longer than most human lives. There were 18 of us who encountered the Antaran during Operation Highjump, not just Bunger and me, but other flight crews who descended through different passages, ground personnel who were taken into the interior for negotiations, and Admiral Byrd himself who served as primary liaison. By 1950, 3 years after we returned, 4 of them were dead. By 1960, another 6. By 1980, I was one of only 3 survivors. Today, I'm the only one left who can tell this story without fear of government retaliation, because I'm dying anyway, and they can't threaten me with anything worse than what's already coming. The first death was Commander Bunger himself, the man who'd flown with me into the interior world and seen everything I'd seen. In 1950, 3 years after we returned from Antarctica, he was killed in what was officially ruled an aircraft accident during a routine training flight. His plane crashed in the desert outside of San Diego in clear weather, with no mechanical failures that investigators could identify. I was stationed at Norfolk at the time, 3,000 miles away, but I knew immediately it wasn't an accident. Bunger was one of the finest pilots in the Navy. He'd flown combat missions over the Pacific, had landed on aircraft carriers in storms, had navigated through the interior of the Earth itself. Men like that don't die in routine training accidents unless someone wants them dead. I tried to attend his funeral, but I was denied leave. I tried to contact his widow, but my letters were intercepted. The message was clear. Even acknowledging our connection was a security risk. Over the next decades, the pattern repeated with horrifying consistency. In 1953, Lieutenant James Morrison, who'd been part of the ground team that entered the interior, died of a sudden heart attack at age 32, despite being in perfect health and having no family history of cardiac issues. In 1958, Captain Richard Henderson drove his car off a cliff in Colorado, ruled as suicide despite having a wife and 3 children and no history of depression. In 1962, Admiral Byrd himself died of heart failure, and while he was 73 and his death was medically plausible, the timing was suspicious. He'd been scheduled to give testimony before a congressional committee about unusual Antarctic phenomena and died 2 days before that testimony was to occur. Each death was individually explainable, but collectively they formed a pattern that was impossible to ignore. People who knew about the Antaran died young, died suddenly, and died under circumstances that prevented them from ever revealing what they knew. I survived because I learned the rules early and followed them perfectly. I never spoke about Antarctica except in official debriefing sessions with authorized personnel. I never sought out other survivors of Operation Highjump. I never kept journals or written records of what I'd experienced. I accepted every assignment the Navy gave me without complaint, even when those assignments were clearly designed to keep me isolated and monitored. I married a woman who had security clearance and understood that there were parts of my career I couldn't discuss. I raised children who learned not to ask their father about the years he spent in the Antarctic. I became invisible, unremarkable, exactly the kind of veteran who'd served his country and retired quietly without making waves. And I watched, year after year, as my knowledge became more isolated, more singular, until I was the sole repository of a truth that the world needed to know, but that I was forbidden to share. The psychological cost was devastating in ways I didn't anticipate when I was young, and thought I was strong enough to carry any burden. I would lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the Antaran warning that we had 10 to 15 years before nuclear weapons testing would cross the threshold into planetary catastrophe. That deadline came and went in the early 1960s, and while the catastrophic collapse they'd predicted didn't happen immediately, I could see evidence of the damage they'd warned about. The magnetic poles were shifting faster than historical records suggested was normal. Earthquake frequency was increasing, weather patterns were becoming more extreme and unpredictable, and every nuclear test, and there were hundreds of them through the 50s and 60s, made me wonder if this would be the one that finally pushed the planetary systems past the point of no return. I tried once, only once, to break the silence. It was 1963 during the height of the Cold War, when the Cuban Missile Crisis had just brought the world to the brink of nuclear war, and I couldn't stay silent anymore, knowing what I knew about what those weapons would ultimately do to the planet. I wrote a letter to President Kennedy, not mentioning Antarctica or the Antaran by name, but trying to convey the urgency of nuclear disarmament, using language that wouldn't violate classification. The letter never reached the president. Instead, I received a visit from 2 men who reminded me in very explicit terms what would happen if I ever attempted to communicate classified information again. "Your wife teaches elementary school," one of them said, leaving the threat implicit but clear. "Your children attend public school. These are very uncertain times. Accidents happen." I never tried again after that. The price of truth was too high when it could be paid by people I loved. The worst part was watching the government do exactly what the Antaran had warned against. Not just continuing nuclear testing, but actively seeking to acquire Antaran technology for military purposes. Through my contacts in the Navy, I learned that multiple attempts were made to re-establish contact with the interior world throughout the 1950s and 1960s. Expeditions were sent to map the passages we'd discovered, to establish permanent monitoring stations near the openings, even to attempt forced entry when the Antaran sealed the passages against us. Every attempt failed, usually with casualties that were explained as equipment failures or environmental hazards. The Antaran had withdrawn completely, sealing themselves away from a surface world they'd tried to warn, but which had chosen weapons over survival. By the 1970s, I'd been retired from the Navy for years and was living a quiet life in San Diego, far from Antarctica, and further still from the extraordinary experiences of my youth. I thought I'd successfully disappeared into ordinary life, that the government had decided I was no longer a security risk worth monitoring. I was wrong. In 1977, on the 30th anniversary of Operation Highjump, I received a visit from a woman who introduced herself as being from a government archive project documenting Cold War military operations. She asked me questions that made it clear she knew exactly what had happened in 1947, that she was testing whether I was still maintaining operational security or whether age and distance from active service had made me careless. I passed her test by claiming I remembered almost nothing from the mission, that it had been routine mapping operations in extremely cold conditions, and that the most exciting thing that happened was seeing penguins. She seemed satisfied and left. I never saw her again, but I understood. Even in retirement, even 30 years later, I was still being watched. The loneliness of carrying this knowledge became unbearable as I aged. Everyone I could have talked to was dead or too afraid to acknowledge what they knew. My wife died in 1995, having lived 50 years married to a man who could never fully share what had shaped him most profoundly. My children grew up and had children of their own, and I watched them live their lives in complete ignorance of the fact that their planet was hosting two civilizations, one on the surface that thought it was alone, one in the interior that was hiding from the surface's destructive tendencies. I wanted to tell them, wanted to explain why I sometimes stared at maps of Antarctica with an expression they couldn't interpret, why I followed news about magnetic pole shifts and tectonic activity with intensity that seemed disproportionate, why I became agitated whenever nuclear weapons were discussed in the news. As I entered my 90s and then passed 100 years old, outliving every prediction my doctors made about my longevity, I started to understand that I'd been preserved for a purpose, not by the government. They would have preferred I died decades ago, but by something else, maybe fate or chance or the universe's sense of irony. I was the last witness, the final living connection to the truth about what exists beneath the ice. And I was still alive because that truth needed to survive beyond the classification and the cover-ups and the institutional denial. In 2019, when I turned 100 years old, I made a decision. I was going to live long enough to tell this story, and I was going to set up systems that would ensure it reached the public after my death, regardless of what the government tried to do to stop it. That's when I started recording these testimonies. That's when I reached out to the journalists and researchers I'd been quietly vetting for years. And that's when I stopped caring about the consequences, because the only consequence that mattered anymore was the truth dying with me. I need to tell you why I'm breaking my silence now in 2024, after 77 years of watching and waiting. It's not just because I'm dying, though that's true enough. My heart is failing, and I have weeks at most, according to my doctors. It's because the Antaran are coming back, not in the way they did in 1947. With diplomatic contact and warnings delivered to military expeditions. This time they're preparing to emerge publicly, and the signs are everywhere if you know what to look for. I've been tracking these indicators for the past 5 years, watching the pattern accelerate, and I understand now that the timeline the Antaran warned us about in 1947 wasn't wrong. It was just longer than they calculated, extended by factors they didn't fully account for. But we're reaching the threshold now, right now, and the planet is sending signals that can't be ignored much longer. The magnetic poles have been shifting dramatically over the past 2 decades, moving faster than at any point in recorded history. The North Magnetic Pole has moved over 1,000 miles since the year 2000, accelerating from about 10 miles per year to nearly 40 miles per year. Scientists are calling it an anomaly, suggesting we might be approaching a magnetic reversal that happens every several 100,000 years. But I know what it really is. The destabilizing effect of 70 years of nuclear testing finally accumulating to the point where planetary energy systems are beginning to fail, exactly as the Antaran predicted. The magnetic field protects Earth from solar radiation, and as it weakens, we're seeing increased cosmic ray penetration, more intense auroras at lower latitudes, and disruption of navigation systems worldwide that rely on magnetic references. The seismic activity is even more concerning. Since 2010, there's been a statistically significant increase in major earthquakes, not just in frequency but in unexpected locations. Earthquakes in regions that haven't experienced significant seismic activity in recorded history. The U.S. Geological Survey calls it natural variation, but the pattern matches exactly what the Antaran showed us in their holographic projections of planetary destabilization. The Ring of Fire is becoming more active, volcanic eruptions are increasing, and most disturbing, there have been seismic events detected deep beneath Antarctica, in locations that correspond almost exactly to where I know the interior world cities are located. The Antaran cities are experiencing the geological stress they warned would come, and they're responding to it. But what convinced me that direct contact is imminent, that the Antaran are preparing to reveal themselves, is what's been happening in Antarctica itself over the past decade. The ice is melting faster than any climate model predicted, revealing land masses and features that aren't supposed to exist according to official geography. In 2018, NASA released satellite images showing massive cavities beneath Antarctic glaciers, voids large enough to contain the water volume of lakes, forming in places where no one can explain the heat source that's creating them. Official explanation: geothermal activity. But I know those locations. They're near the passages to the interior world. And what's creating the heat is increased activity from the Antaran civilization as they prepare their infrastructure for possible surface emergence. The government knows something is happening. I still have contacts from my military days, people who trust me because they don't know what I know. And through them, I've learned about expeditions being mounted to Antarctica with frequency and urgency that doesn't match the public explanation of scientific research. In 2016, there was unusual high-level traffic to Antarctic bases. Secretary of State John Kerry visited Antarctica during the presidential election. Patriarch Kirill of the Russian Orthodox Church visited. Multiple world leaders made trips that were explained as climate research tourism, but which involved military-level security. Someone is preparing for something, and the coordination between governments that are officially adversaries suggests they're responding to a shared concern that supersedes normal geopolitical competition. More significantly, there's been a subtle but unmistakable shift in how governments and media discuss unusual phenomena. UFO sightings that would have been dismissed and ridiculed 20 years ago are now being acknowledged by military officials and investigated by government agencies with serious budgets. The Pentagon released videos of Navy pilots encountering objects that violate known physics, performing maneuvers that our technology can't replicate. The official narrative has shifted from "these things don't exist" to "these things exist, but we don't know what they are," which is preparing the public for eventual revelation that they do know what they are, and they've known for decades. This is controlled disclosure, gradually acclimating populations to the idea that non-human intelligence exists, so that when the truth about the Antaran comes out, it doesn't cause the complete social collapse that sudden revelation would trigger. I've also been monitoring scientific publications about discoveries that seem designed to prepare academia for paradigm shifts. Archaeologists are now openly discussing the possibility of advanced civilizations existing during the Ice Age, before the Younger Dryas event that the Antaran told us was actually the collapse of their surface civilization. Geologists are publishing papers about evidence of massive flooding events approximately 12,000 years ago that match the timeline the Antaran gave us. Marine biologists are finding species in extreme deep-sea environments that challenge assumptions about where complex life can exist, indirectly preparing the scientific community for the revelation that complex ecosystems exist in Earth's interior. None of these researchers know the full context, but someone is funding this research, encouraging these questions, building the intellectual framework that will make the Antaran revelation comprehensible when it comes. But the most direct evidence that something is changing came to me personally in 2020. I received a package at my care facility, delivered by a courier service with no return address and no indication of who sent it. Inside was a small crystalline device, identical to the ones the Antaran gave us in 1947, along with a handwritten note that said simply, "Captain Callahan, they remember you. They are coming. Prepare humanity." The device activated when I touched it, projecting a holographic message directly into my visual cortex the same way Antaran telepathic communication works. The message was from Meridian, or someone using that designation, and it explained that the Antaran had been monitoring surface conditions and had concluded that the planetary destabilization they warned about has progressed further than they can allow. They are preparing to break their isolation and make open contact with surface governments, not as supplicants requesting cooperation, but as planetary co-inhabitants demanding action to prevent mutual extinction. The message included a timeline. Between 2025 and 2030, the Antaran will begin emerging from the interior in numbers that can't be hidden or explained away. They will reveal themselves to the scientific community first, providing evidence of their civilization and their history that will be impossible to dismiss. They will share technology that addresses climate change and energy production, not as gifts, but as necessary interventions to stabilize planetary systems before it's too late. And they will demand that surface governments acknowledge the historical reality, that Earth has hosted two civilizations for the past 12,000 years, that one civilization tried to warn the other about existential dangers and was ignored, and that cooperation is now mandatory rather than optional. The controlled disclosure we're seeing in government statements about UFOs is preparation for this revelation, an attempt to manage the narrative before the Antaran make it impossible to maintain the old lies. That's why I'm making this recording now, why I'm violating 77 years of enforced silence despite the risks. The truth is coming out whether I speak or not, whether the government wants it or not. But I want the truth to come from someone who was there, who saw the Antaran civilization when it was still completely hidden, who heard their warnings when there was still time to avoid the crisis we're now facing. I want people to understand that this isn't sudden contact with unknown aliens. This is reconciliation with the original inhabitants of Earth who retreated underground when their civilization collapsed and who are now being forced to return because the newcomers on the surface are threatening to destroy the entire planet. And I want you to know that everything you're about to learn from official sources about discovered civilizations and unexpected findings in Antarctica is information that your governments have known for at least 77 years, and probably much longer. They lied to you about the shape of your world, about the history of your species, and about the fact that you share this planet with another civilization that has been watching you in silence while you've been racing toward extinction. The Antaran are coming, and when they arrive, you'll need to decide whether to see them as invaders or as the original inhabitants of a world we've been destroying in our ignorance. Before I finish this testimony, I need to give you something concrete, something you can verify independently, so you know this isn't the delusion of a dying old man. I'm going to provide you with specific coordinates, dates, and evidence that you can cross-reference with satellite imagery, declassified documents, and scientific data. Some of this information will be immediately verifiable. Some of it will require resources and access that most civilians don't have. But all of it is real, and all of it points to the same conclusion. There is a civilization living beneath the Antarctic ice, and the passages to their world exist in locations that governments have been monitoring and restricting access to for the past 77 years. The primary passage that Commander Bunger and I descended through in January 1947 is located at coordinates 82 Quound 51s, 135-12 E, in the interior of East Antarctica, approximately 600 miles from the coast and 2 miles beneath the current ice surface. If you examine satellite imagery of this region, and you'll need to use older imagery from before 2010, because more recent images have been digitally altered or classified, you'll see a circular thermal anomaly approximately 1 kilometer in diameter, showing temperatures 15 to 20 degrees warmer than the surrounding ice sheet. Official explanation is geothermal activity from volcanic vents. Actual explanation is heat radiating from the passage opening, and the Antaran city of Luminara that exists 3 miles below that point in the interior world. The second major passage is located at 77 S, 142 E, closer to the coast in the region the Nazis called Neuschwabenland, or New Swabia. This is the passage the German expedition discovered in 1938 and used to access the interior until the Antaran sealed it in 1945. If you research Nazi Antarctic expeditions, and I know this sounds like conspiracy theory, but I'm giving you the search terms so you can verify it yourself, you'll find that the 1938-39 German Antarctic expedition, led by Captain Alfred Richard, claimed over 230,000 square miles of territory, and took over 11,000 photographs of the region. Most of those photographs remain classified by both German and Allied archives. The ones that have been released show geometric patterns in the ice that don't match natural formation, and in several images you can see what appears to be constructed entrances partially covered by snow. Those are real. I've seen them in person. There are at least 5 other passages that I'm aware of, though I haven't personally visited all of them. One exists beneath the Transantarctic Mountains at approximately 85°15 S, 160°30 W. Another is located in West Antarctica at 79°18 S, 102°45 W. A third exists beneath the Antarctic Peninsula at 72°48, 61°12 W. These coordinates will show up as restricted zones if you try to plan expeditions to them, areas where research permits are inexplicably denied, where unusual military activity occurs despite Antarctica being designated as a demilitarized scientific preserve, where satellite coverage has unexplained gaps or alterations. The governments monitoring these sites, United States, Russia, China, United Kingdom, and others with Antarctic programs, have established research stations that are really observation posts monitoring these passages for Antaran activity. For those of you who want documentary evidence beyond coordinates, I'm going to tell you about specific declassified files you can request through Freedom of Information Act or equivalent mechanisms in other countries. Look for Operation Highjump after-action reports, specifically the classified annexes that were partially declassified in 1997. You'll find references to unusual magnetic disturbances, unexplained equipment failures, and personnel encounters with unidentified phenomena. The language is carefully sanitized, but between the lines you can see what we actually found. Look for Admiral Byrd's personal journals from his 1929 Antarctic expedition, portions of which were released in 2006. You'll find entries describing land beyond the pole and warm valleys where no warm valleys should exist. Look for Nazi documents captured after World War II, specifically files related to their Antarctic operations and the Ahnenerbe organization that was searching for ancient civilizations. You'll find references to the Ancient Ones and the Inner Earth that confirm everything I've told you about their contact with the Antaran. Physical evidence exists as well, though most of it is locked in classified government archives or private collections that aren't accessible to the public. But some pieces have leaked over the decades. The crystalline power devices the Antaran gave us, I know that at least 3 of them ended up in private hands rather than government storage, because scientists who examined them published academic papers about anomalous energy-generating crystals of unknown origin in the 1950s, before being forced to retract their findings. If you search academic journals from 1952-1955, you'll find these retracted papers, and if you look at who authored them, you'll find that several of those scientists died or disappeared shortly after publication. The metallic alloys we found in the Nazi base, samples of those were analyzed, and the composition was published in materials science journals in the 1960s as unidentified metals with properties inconsistent with known metallurgy. Again, the papers were retracted or classified, but they existed long enough to be referenced in other research. For verification of the Antaran warnings about planetary destabilization, you don't need classified documents. You just need to look at publicly available scientific data with the context I've given you. Graph the frequency and magnitude of earthquakes since 1945, and you'll see an accelerating increase that started around 1960, exactly when the Antaran predicted we'd begin seeing effects. Chart the movement of Earth's magnetic poles, and you'll see the acceleration that started in the 1990s and has been increasing exponentially. Look at the data on atmospheric radiation levels, tectonic stress measurements, volcanic activity worldwide. All of it shows systems under increasing stress, and all of it matches the progression the Antaran holographic projections showed us in 1947. The scientific community attributes this to natural variability or climate change caused by greenhouse gases, and while human industrial activity is certainly a factor, the underlying cause is exactly what the Antaran warned about: destabilization of planetary energy systems caused by nuclear weapons testing over the past 77 years. The most accessible evidence, though, is in the patterns of government behavior around Antarctica itself. Ask yourself why Antarctica is the only continent on Earth that's governed by an international treaty that essentially forbids normal national sovereignty and commercial exploitation. The Antarctic Treaty of 1959, signed just 12 years after Operation Highjump, established rules that seem designed to restrict access and maintain secrecy rather than to promote scientific cooperation. Why are there sections of Antarctica that are completely off-limits to even credentialed researchers? Why do certain coordinates trigger automatic permit denials from the international authorities? Why has satellite imagery of Antarctica been progressively restricted over the past decades, with more and more areas being blurred or excluded from public mapping services? The official explanation is environmental protection, but that doesn't explain why the restricted zones don't correlate with ecologically sensitive areas and instead cluster around the passage coordinates I've given you. Watch what happens over the next few years as the Antaran prepare to emerge. You'll see increased military activity in Antarctica disguised as research operations. You'll see more high-profile visits by world leaders to Antarctic bases, explained as climate change awareness tours. You'll see discoveries of ancient structures or artifacts beneath the ice that will be presented as archaeological surprises, but which are actually controlled releases of information the governments have known about for decades. You'll see the narrative around unidentified aerial phenomena shift from "we don't know what these are" to "we're investigating possible non-human intelligence" to eventually "we've known about this for years and here's why we kept it secret." This is all theater, carefully choreographed disclosure designed to manage public reaction to truths that can no longer be hidden. Finally, I want to address those of you who might work in government agencies or military intelligence, who might be reading transcripts of this recording as part of damage control assessment. You know what I'm saying is true because you've seen the same classified files I've seen, or newer ones that confirm everything I experienced in 1947. You're following protocols that were established decades ago to contain this information and neutralize people who try to reveal it. But I'm 105 years old and dying. You can't threaten me with consequences that death is about to deliver anyway. And more importantly, the Antaran are forcing your hand. The timeline for controlled disclosure has collapsed because planetary destabilization is accelerating faster than your models predicted. You can either get ahead of this revelation and try to maintain some credibility with the populations you're supposed to serve, or you can be caught in the lies when the Antaran emerge and expose everything you've been hiding. Your choice, but the time for choosing is running out. The truth is coming whether you're ready for it or not, and my testimony is just the beginning of an avalanche you can't stop. I'm nearing the end of this testimony, and I need to tell you what it's been like to live 77 years with this knowledge. What it costs to carry a truth that could change everything but which you're forbidden to share. I've lived longer than any man in my family, outlived 3 wives and all 4 of my children, watched the world change in ways that would have seemed like science fiction to the young pilot who flew into the Antarctic interior in 1947. I've seen humanity go to the moon, the real moon, the one in orbit, not the interior world beneath our feet. And I've watched us develop technologies that the Antaran warned would destroy us if we didn't use them wisely. And through all of it, through every major event of the past 77 years, I've known something that would have changed how humanity understood every one of those moments. And I've had to stay silent while the world made decisions based on incomplete information. The hardest part wasn't the fear of government retaliation, though that was real enough and cost me friends and colleagues who couldn't keep the secret. The hardest part was watching humanity make the same mistakes the Antaran made 12,000 years ago, building weapons we didn't understand, ignoring warnings from those who knew better, prioritizing short-term strategic advantage over long-term survival, and knowing that I'd been shown exactly where this path leads but couldn't warn anyone who might actually change course. I watched the nuclear arms race of the Cold War, watched the atmospheric testing that the Antaran explicitly warned would destabilize planetary systems, watched the Cuban Missile Crisis bring us to the brink of using these weapons in warfare, and all I could do was pray that somehow we'd stumble into wisdom we didn't earn. I've thought a lot about Admiral Byrd's last words to me, his confession that he'd carried this knowledge for 18 years before I inherited it, and that he'd watched every government administration ignore the warnings and choose weapons over planetary stability. He died in 1962, 15 years after giving me that burden. And I've now carried it for another 62 years beyond his death. That's 77 years of watching, waiting, hoping that somehow the people in power would choose differently, that someone with authority would take the Antaran warnings seriously enough to change course. It never happened. The weapons kept being built, the testing continued, and the planetary destabilization the Antaran predicted has been unfolding exactly as they said it would, just slower than their initial calculations suggested, because Earth's systems were more resilient than they estimated. But resilience isn't the same as invulnerability, and we're approaching the breaking point now. What I want you to understand is that this isn't about aliens or UFOs or conspiracy theories in the way popular culture uses those terms. This is about the fact that Earth has hosted two intelligent civilizations for the past 12,000 years. One on the surface that thought it was alone, one in the interior that withdrew after a catastrophic failure and has been watching the surface civilization repeat the same mistakes. The Antaran aren't invaders from another world. They're the original inhabitants of this one, or at least they were here long before modern humans built our first cities. We're the newcomers who inherited a planet we didn't fully understand and proceeded to damage it in our ignorance. And now we're at a point where the damage threatens both civilizations, surface and interior, and the Antaran are being forced to break their 12,000-year isolation because our ignorance has become their problem too. I don't know what will happen when they emerge publicly, when the controlled disclosure that's been happening in slow motion for the past decade accelerates into open contact that can't be denied or explained away. I hope that humanity will be wise enough to listen to what they have to teach us, to accept help from beings who've already lived through the catastrophe we're approaching and know how to prevent it. I hope that we'll recognize the Antaran as partners in planetary survival, rather than as threats to human dominance or challenges to religious certainty. But I'm not optimistic, because I've watched how humans react to information that challenges their worldview. And I know that admitting we've been wrong about something as fundamental as the geography of our own planet is going to be psychologically devastating for billions of people. To those of you who are listening to this with genuine curiosity and open minds, who are willing to investigate the evidence I've provided and think critically about what it means, you're the reason I've made this recording. Not for the people who will dismiss it immediately as fantasy or fabrication, and not for the government officials who already know it's true and have been lying about it for decades, but for the people in between who are capable of updating their understanding when confronted with new information. You're going to need to be bridges in the days ahead, people who can help others process the revelation that our planet is stranger and more wonderful than we've been taught, that we share it with another civilization that's been hidden in plain sight, and that cooperation with that civilization might be the only thing that saves both our peoples from the consequences of our mistakes. I'm making this recording in November 2024, and I'll be dead before the year ends. My doctors have made that clear, and I can feel my body shutting down in ways that leave no doubt. But I don't fear death anymore, not after living 105 years and watching everyone I loved precede me. What I fear is that the truth will die with me, that the government will successfully suppress this testimony the way they've suppressed so many others, and that humanity will face the Antaran emergence without the context that would make it comprehensible. That's why I've set up redundant release systems, given copies of this recording to people I trust in different countries and different contexts, embedded the information in places where it can't all be erased even if some of it is intercepted. The truth is going to survive me. It has to. To my family, if any of you are hearing this after my death, I'm sorry I couldn't share this with you during my life. I'm sorry that I was distant sometimes, that I couldn't explain why I followed Antarctic news so obsessively, or why I reacted so strongly to nuclear weapons discussions, or why I seemed to be carrying a weight I couldn't articulate. You deserve to know the truth about what shaped your father and grandfather, but I couldn't risk your safety by telling you while government suppression was still absolutely enforced. Now that I'm gone and the Antaran are emerging anyway, you can know what I experienced and why it mattered so much to me that I stayed alive long enough to ensure the story survived. I hope you can forgive me for the secrets I kept, and I hope you can understand that everything I did, including the silence, was an attempt to protect you while preserving a truth that the world needed to hear. To the Antaran, if any of you are monitoring surface communications and happen to intercept this recording, Meridian, if you're still alive after 77 years, which your lifespan suggests you might be, thank you for the trust you showed Commander Bunger and me in 1947. Thank you for trying to warn us, even though you knew we probably wouldn't listen. Thank you for not giving up on humanity despite our ignorance and our violence, and our refusal to learn from the mistakes you made 12,000 years ago. I kept my promise to deliver your message, even though it was ignored at the highest levels. I've watched for the signs of your return, and I believe I've seen them. I won't live to witness your emergence, but I've done what I can to prepare humanity for it by leaving this testimony. I hope that when you do reveal yourselves, you'll find that at least some humans are ready to meet you with openness rather than fear, with cooperation rather than hostility, with willingness to learn rather than certainty, that we already know everything worth knowing. And to anyone listening to this who thinks I'm insane or deluded, who's convinced this is elaborate fiction or the confused memories of a dying old man, I understand your skepticism. I would be skeptical too if I hadn't lived through it myself. But I've given you coordinates you can verify, documents you can request, scientific data you can examine, and predictions about what's coming that you can test against events over the next few years. Don't take my word for any of this. Investigate, question, verify. Use the same critical thinking and demand for evidence that you would apply to any extraordinary claim. And when the Antaran do emerge, when the governments can no longer maintain the fiction that we're alone on this planet, remember that a 105-year-old Navy captain tried to warn you, tried to give you context, so the revelation wouldn't be a complete shock. Remember that the truth was available if you were willing to look for it, and that the only reason it seemed unbelievable was because you'd been systematically lied to about the nature of your world for your entire life. This is Captain Robert James Callahan, United States Navy, retired, recording what will likely be my final testimony. I flew into the interior of the Earth in January 1947 as part of Operation Highjump. I met a civilization that's been living beneath the Antarctic ice for 12,000 years. I was warned that human nuclear weapons development would destroy the planet if we didn't change course. I was ordered to keep this information secret for the rest of my life, and I've honored that order for 77 years while watching the world I was trying to protect march steadily toward the catastrophe I was forbidden to warn them about. Now I'm dying, and the Antaran are returning, and the truth can no longer be contained. I've done what I can to preserve this knowledge and prepare you for what's coming. The rest is up to you, whether to investigate or ignore, whether to prepare or deny, whether to meet our planetary neighbors with wisdom or with the same ignorance that's characterized human response to everything that challenges our comfortable certainties. I hope you choose wisdom. For all our sakes, I hope you choose wisdom. This recording is ended. May God have mercy on us all, whichever God that might be, in a cosmos that's proven to be far stranger than any theology prepared us for.